next topic of discussion is transitioning out. A lot of the questions that we get about transition are transitioning out. What are some of the things that I should consider? When would be the appropriate time to transition out? And what are some of the questions that I'm going to want to ask myself as I transition out of dentistry?
Number one important question to answer for the person considering transitioning out is, am I ready? Am I psychologically ready? Am I financially ready? Am I ready to go to the next adventure in my life? Am I ready to step away from this? And being a dentist requires a huge commitment to relationships for a lifetime, for a career. The people who are successful, of course, are really good at that. And that is always the thing they miss the most when they step away. So are you ready to do that? And I think a lot of people regret the fact that they retired because they hadn't processed through all of those questions. And retire early or aren't quite prepared to do that.
Yeah. What would constitute being ready? What would be some of the key indicators of being ready?
A key indicator, a huge one, is, are you financially ready? Are you personally ready for not being a dentist anymore? And what is life going to be like for you on that Monday morning when you wake up and you don't have to go in that day or that week? It's over. That part of your career is over. So how much of my identity do I take from being a dentist? And how big an issue will that be when I'm no longer a dentist? Will I know who I am? Or will I be just so excited and happy about the new possibilities that await me in the next phase of my life? And so I think you do it as we talk about planning all of these transitions. This is the ultimate plan that's required, that you and your spouse really sit down and get into this. How do I negotiate or renegotiate the relationship with my spouse? How does 24/7 sound to the spouse who's been sitting there without you for this amount of time? You know, the old line about I married you for better or for worse, but not for every lunch. This is something that really causes some shock in the marriage relationship. So it really is important to have the spouse involved in the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had some retired dentists tell me that they never really contemplated how much money they spend when they don't work. It's pretty shocking how much money on a daily basis.
Exactly. And we ask them, how long do you intend to live? And some say, well, I've never been asked that question before. Well, the indication, you know, there's some indication as to how long we intend to live by the way we're living now.
Yeah.
Whether we're consciously thinking about it or not. And how will that money stretch, and how much is available to you, and what kind of lifestyle are you going to need to support in your retirement, and do you have the capacity to do that? You need a plan there. You need to do that with your financial advisor, so you're absolutely certain that you can do it.
Yeah. Research indicates that 1 in 3 babies that are born today will live to be 100.
Yes.
And with the advancements in prescription medications and lifestyle and what doctors know now, that we have the ability to keep people alive a lot longer than they ever anticipated. So that can play a huge role in your willingness or ability to transition out.
I just recently read that 83% of Americans live past 65. You know, and when you think about the age 65 was used as the target for retirement historically in our country. It goes way back to the beginning of the last century. That date was set, or that age was determined, when almost nobody was living to 65. And way less than half of the people in 1900 lived to age 65. Now 83% are living past 65. It's astonishing statistics.
Well, once you figure out you're ready to transition out, what are the ways that you can because there's a multitude of ways that you can transition out.
Yes.
You can titrate your practice, you can bring in an associate, you can sell part of it. Tell us the ways that you can start to consider transitioning out, because a lot of people think, well, the only way that I can transition out is just to sell my practice.
Yes, that still is the primary way that most people do it. To wait until sometime. If my goal were to retire in 5 years, I would want to put and I was just going to sell my practice and leave, it would behoove me to put a plan together in 3 years and begin a search for my successor in 3 years, knowing that it might take a year or two to accomplish that. So again, plans and timetables are really important. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it, depending on the size and scope of the practice, some people have practices that are too large to sell typically to one owner, to one buyer. And so they need a longer plan. That might be an 8-year plan or a 10-year plan. And they would sell to 2 people. They'd take their equity out twice. I have clients who've taken their equity out 3 and 4 times over a 15-year period, bringing in 4 different doctors as the practice continued to grow and build. I have a situation going on right now with a client who is doing a merger acquisition. The one client is and they're in the same building. The one client is, this is the first time I've ever had 2 guys in the same building. That's about the smoothest transition you'll ever see. Wow. One's going from the 4th floor to the 7th floor. Moving the practice in with another great client, and it's a merger acquisition. That's another possibility. Another possibility would be to, and some propose this, I'm not a fan of it at all, but some say, why don't you just practice another couple of years and just close it? You'll get, in a couple of years, you'll get approximately what you would have gotten when you sold it, so why go through all the hassle, just close it? I wouldn't do that. There are times when you have to do that in a small community where you can't find a buyer or something like that. But I really believe in legacy. And I think when somebody puts together a dental practice, one of the amazing things about a successful dental practice is that it has the capacity to outlive you and to continue to serve the community that you're in long after you're not in it anymore, and continue to employ people and continue to serve those patients who come for care. That's amazing.
Awesome. Now, when you start this, once you pick an avenue in which you're going to choose to transition out, whatever that method is, what are some of the things you want to do in the practice to prepare for that moment? Obviously, having optimal profitability, showing that the practice has growth, accounts receivable, the schedule. What are some of the things that you're going to want to do to prepare that schedule or prepare the practice for the transition out?
All those things are really important that you just mentioned, of course, Kirk. Another thing that's really important has to do with your team. Do you have some people who've been with you for a long time whose intention is to transition out when you transition out? If so, it's going to hurt your sale price. It's going to hurt the amount of goodwill in the sale price, and it's going to hurt the patient retention component of the purchase for the buyer if you have a lot of turnover. So you want to put a plan together to transition those people in preparation for your retirement and the sale of your practice, and involve, if you can, the new owner in the selection of other new people, and then practice together with that new owner, with the new owner in the practice for at least a short time, so you incorporate those new people into it. Another thing is you need to do an assessment of your suite. For example, if your practice is worth, having done an evaluation on it, if your practice is worth $500,000 and the buyers and everything is dated, the suite looks like it's 20 years old and doesn't have the latest technology, it's not digital, it doesn't have all the technology and everything, you're going to have to do one of two things. You're going to have to decide, I'm not going to do anything about that and go to the expense of putting those things in, but then I'm going to have to be prepared at point of sale to have that additional investment over the top of the payment of the purchase price that the buyer will have to make. The additional investment in new technology is going to come right off my sale price. So you have to account for it one way or the other. You either do that, or you go ahead and upgrade and update your suite prior to transitioning it. I recommend the latter. Although you don't have to go to a ridiculous amount of expense, you need to have something that somebody can walk into and practice in. Graduating dentists from our dental schools have never seen a paper patient chart. They have never seen one. And so they're not going to practice that way. In fact, they're grossed out by it, handling them, and so those issues become large as well.
Okay. Once you determine you're ready, then you picked your avenue, then you prepared the practice for this transition. Where do I start? Where would I start to look into transitioning out?
That's when you package your practice opportunity. You put a prospectus together. You have the practice valued, so you know what's going to happen, and then you take it to the marketplace. You get on websites. You advertise in your community. You let appropriate quality dental supply people know. Not only that you're looking to transition, but that you're looking for a certain specific type of individual. And if they come along, that would be a great way to go. I'll tell you a story. I had a client who was looking to transition his practice. This was in Canada. Looking to transition his practice, and we went through and identified an ideal candidate profile, took it to the marketplace, and I was in town, and one day I suggested, have you talked to your lab person, your lab guy who owns the lab you've had this long-term relationship with, and asked him, has he seen any really outstanding young dentists in the community who are looking for practice opportunities? And so he called the lab guy, took him to lunch, and he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, there's one right now. He said, in fact, this guy's working in a practice that has fixed fee schedules and is just an employment situation for him. And they have their own lab, but he won't use their lab. He uses me, and he pays the difference out of his own pocket because he won't put the other lab cases in his patients' mouths. He said, well, we've got to talk to him. Yeah. And he became the buyer of the practice. The
transitioning out of a practice, that can take, sometimes it can be 6 months, it could be 6 years. It could be longer than that.
It can be longer than that. This is an area that really has to be discussed and planned well. Okay. For example, it can't be 6 months if it's a solo practice only large enough for one dentist. It can't be that long. It can be 90 days. As long as a whole bunch of important things happen within that 90 days, as long as a letter of introduction and endorsement goes out, as long as the team really knows and understands who the new owner is, as long as they can tell that person's story and endorse him or her to the patients all day, every day in the practice, and as long as there can be an elegant phased exit where the only role of the seller is to play maitre d' and introduce in that case, the buyer to everybody as they come in, and then phase out over a 90 or 120 day period. If the practice is substantial enough or large enough, or if there's a really important mentoring aspect to the relationship, then it can go on for years. The thing you don't want to happen, the thing that all buyers are afraid of because they've heard the horror stories, the thing you don't want to have happen is for the seller to become so entrenched in the practice that you can't get rid of him or her when there really isn't a role, and where the seller's continued presence in the practice actually blocks the patients from transferring to the new owner who needs to have them in the schedule because now they're paying all the overhead and doing the debt retirement on their note. So these have to, the amount of time will be dictated by what the practice allows you to do. That plus the relationship between the parties. You know, Kirk, all of these transitions that are of any length at all always make or break at the behavioral level.
Tell us more. What does that mean? Tell us a little bit more about what that means.
It's important to get the contracts right. You know, the working agreements right. It's important to have the valuation done properly by a professional and have the numbers be fair. It's important to do cash flow pro formas so that the buyer will know in advance whether they can afford this practice, and those things are extremely important aspects of transitions. But the most important aspect of the transition is the relationship between the two doctors. Do they like each other? Are they easy to be around? Do they have things in common. I find there is plenty of room for differences in personal styles as long as there's a huge overlap at the core in terms of personal values.
Absolutely.
I've got a situation right now where where a partnership has been formed, and one of the partners is very, very difficult behaviorally to be with. And it looks like something's going to have to be done in order for the partnership to succeed, or the partnership is going to have to split.
Yeah.
And that's painful and expensive.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the key point here, is that after you've built a lifetime of building this practice, you've created an incredible asset. We're talking about legacy that you leave behind.
Yes.
And you're considering your future. These are 3 huge pieces of your life that you can't leave to chance. You have to hire an expert and get them involved in helping you navigate these 3 pieces.
You have to. I know so many stories, as do you, about dentists who've done all that with their lives and with their practices, and then sold the practice and retired, and are not welcome back in their old practice because it didn't work out well behaviorally at the end with the other party. Maybe they were competitive with each other. Maybe they were. Maybe they did the transition themselves and left all and discussed and negotiated between themselves. That leaves all kinds of scar tissue. The buyer and the seller need to be distant from each other in the negotiations, and not doing it one-on-one, or somebody's going to get bruised and bloodied, and you'll pay for that later.
Absolutely. So as we take a look at transitioning out, it's very important to determine if you're ready. Number 2, determine the avenue in which you want to take as far as transitioning out. Number 3 would be considering all the variables that have to be improved in the practice. Number 4 is the timeline, and number 5 is obviously hiring an expert to help you manage and navigate all of that.
If you're going to buy or sell a practice, once the transition has happened, that's really when the work begins in so many ways, when they get into the practice and they now need to adapt to a new style. It's really not a transition. Selling and buying a practice is a transaction. What happens after the practice has been bought or sold is usually a transformation, because it's going to morph from something that it was into something that it will be, and what it will be needs to be reflective of the new owner and his or her values and philosophies.